Very excited to have John Lanchester with us this evening. A number of authors who appear here make it easy to characterize them because they've tended to stick to one genre, whether it's literary fiction or biography or cookbooks or something else. John, of course, has not stayed with a single category over his nearly 20 years of writing books. He began with several novels, The Debt Pleasure, Mr. Phillips, Fragrant Harbor, each of which was very well received. Then he came out with a memoir, Family Romance, about 7 years ago. And then the world financial crisis hit, and that has had a profound impact on John's thinking and writing. In I.O.U. 4 years ago, he provided a very literate, shrewd, and not infrequently funny analysis of the financial collapse. And in his social novel Capital 2 years ago, he depicted how the easy money era had affected not just greedy speculators, but how it also played out in the lives of residents of a representative London street. Now he's gone back to basics and written a sort of glossary for economic and financial jargon. His aim, he says, at the start of How to Speak Money, is to enable people to read the business pages and watch the economic news on television and understand what they're seeing and hearing. That's become much harder than it should be for many of us because the walls of obscure terms and arcane concepts have enveloped the workings and the institutions of the financial world. John's particularly well suited to help us navigate through this obscurity and obfuscation, as he showed in his previous books and again shows in this new one. He can present economic principles and financial matters in clear and entertaining ways. He has a journalist's knack for writing lucidly and making the abstract concrete, and that's not surprising since he was a journalist and an editor. He did stints as a soccer reporter, an obituary writer, and at the London Review of Books, he was a deputy editor and a member of the editorial board. He also may have a genetic predisposition for speaking the language of money. His dad, after all, was a banker. In any case, let me just say that How to Speak Money is not only a very enlightening book in and of itself, it also contains, at the end, a further readings section that offers a wonderfully useful and succinct survey of other books on money and economics, including a few that might even help make some of you rich. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming John Lanchester.
Thank you very much. That's the first time that anyone's ever claimed this book will make you rich in my hearing. It's a great pleasure to be back in politics and prose. I've done a bunch of events because this book's been out in England for a month or so now. I've done a bunch of events, and a thing you notice when you have books out at intervals is the trend away from reading. When my first book came out 15 odd years ago, reading was what you did, and you'd often read for 45 minutes or so, and that's what audiences liked and audiences were used to. And over time, it shifted more towards prepared talks, which are actually often much more demanding because you have to write the whole thing out. You can't do it off the top of your head. And I once had this thing happen to me. The British Council, which is the British cultural body, has a worthy mission and is famous for things. Sometimes this is being filmed, so I can't sort of say quite how often, but sometimes go wrong. And I was at a thing in Latvia, in Riga and had a really long, demanding day, partly on the aegis of the British Council and partly had a book coming out. And it was about 7 o'clock, and I'd just done, I think, a reading at the university in Riga. And I was walking down the corridor, thinking, I am absolutely fully cooked. There's an expression they have in the north of England. They say, "Stick a fork in me, lads. I'm done." And I was thinking, my thought bubble was, "Stick a fork in me. I'm done." I say, so that's it then. And my escort said, "Yes, that's it. Apart from the talk to the MA students of English literature." I said, "What?" He says, "Yes, 90 minutes on trends in modern English language literature to graduate students." I said, "But I don't remember, when is that?" He said, "Now," and led me straight into the room. And if I'd had like 5 seconds to prepare, I would have had a tantrum or walked off or said, "No, I need more." But there I was, sitting in front of this room of about 30 Latvian graduate students of English literature. And they do this thing, as Latvians themselves say. They have this tendency to put on an expression at the start of the week and leave it there for the whole week. So it was unequivocally the longest hour and a half of my life. Anyway, so that's what happened with talks. And now it's gone. It went from readings to talks, and now it's gone to straightforwardly to Q&As, because audiences don't like even the kind of informality of a talk is too heavy going. And so it's gone over to Q&As. And so everything I've done for this book has been a Q&A except this. And I said when I was coming over here, they were booking various things, and I said, "Look, I would quite like to do just one thing where I get to read a bit of the book. Pretty please, is that all right?" And they said, "Yes, okay, you best do that at Politics and Prose." Thank you. So thank you. And now don't storm the exits, because if you go to the British Museum in London or any of the great world museums with an Egyptology section, and you look at the Egyptian art, you notice something strange. I don't just mean the strangeness because they're these weird mutant cat god dudes. I mean the strangeness that resides in the dating. And the strangeness is the fact that the dates are extraordinarily wide-ranging. They spend thousands and thousands of years. Periods of up to about 3,000 years, 3 millennia. And yet the art, essentially, from the layman's point of view, doesn't change. Its technique and its symbolism are very, very consistent. And so you have a time span passing equivalent from, Homer reciting the Odyssey in some, smoke-filled encampment in ancient Illyria, to the launch of the iPhone 6. And yet the art and the iconography are the same. And that's because ancient Egypt was the most stable society the world has ever seen. And the stability was based on the annual flooding of the Nile. The whole social order was underpinned by the fact that the Nile would flood every year with total regularity. Every detail of Egyptian life was linked to the flood. Even the tax system was based on the level of the water, because the level of the water determined how profitable the farmers were going to be that year. And Egypt was ruled by god kings, who were part of a priesthood whose centrality into the society was partly to do with the fact they were at the centre of this ritual order which controlled the flood and the year's harvest and was in charge of the whole system. And so it was run by a religious elite who had at its disposal this rich and very emotionally satisfying, to this day it's still very satisfying, mythological system. And it has a subtle and complicated language of symbols that draw on that mythology. And the result is you have this unprecedentedly, unchallengedly stable society lasting for thousands of years. But the priests were cheating because they also had something else. They had a nilometer. This was a secret device made to measure and predict the level of water in that year's flood. It consisted of large permanent measuring stations sited on the river with lines and markers designed to predict the level of the subsequent flood. They were situated in temples to which only the priests had access. And as recently as 1810, which is thousands of years after they'd entered use, foreigners were still forbidden access to them. And added to accurate records of flood patterns dating back for centuries, which only the priests could read because they were the only people who could, the nilometer was an essential tool for control of Egypt. It was essential, and it had to be secret, because otherwise the ruling class and institutions would give up too much of their authority. So this book was born out of the thought that there's a modern equivalent of the nilometer in our society, and it's economics. The language of money is at the heart of modern society and modern power structures. And yet a lot of the time when people hear money and economics being discussed, they literally don't know what's being talked about. I mean, in the most basic and literal way of just not knowing what the words mean. Sometimes I think there's an element of bamboozlement about it. I don't know whether it's deliberate or not. It's tempting to think it is. So termed like a hedge fund, because we all know what a hedge is. A hedge is a hedge. But we don't necessarily know how that turned into something meaning a deregulated pool of private capital operating via a partnership structure, high levels of leverage, and using proprietary investment mathematical techniques. You know, hedge, proprietary mathematics, it seems baffling. And so do hundreds of other similar terms. And my own education in the subject came as Brad was saying, I set out to write a novel about London because I was very struck by the scale and extent of change in London. I grew up in Hong Kong and came to London as an adult. And it seems to me that London's undergone change equivalent to the sort of scale of change that societies have after sort of revolutions or wars. But it's happened incrementally, and so it's easy not to notice. But when you look back over 30 years, it's a totally different place. And I was thinking about writing about it and therefore about what the drivers of that change had been, what the sort of motors had been, and came to the conclusion that one of the main ones, the main one, was to do with finance and the fact that the City of London is or arguably the centre of global financial capital. Bit of an irony that the IMF are in town this weekend, but by chance. And London has been reshaped by the deregulation of global financial services and becoming this sort of magnet for international capital. It's interesting, actually, London's post-war the low population peak was in 1981, which is just before the city started being deregulated, and the explosion of money and everything else happened, is linked to this rise in population. It's literally reshaped the city. And so I just started to find out about money, and I started writing Capital, thinking that a crash was coming. Just because in about 2005 when I started, it seemed very obvious that it was a bubble. It just felt very like a bubble. I'd lived through property crashes before, and it just had that feeling. And so I started the novel thinking that there would be a kind of classic. I began describing this sort of hyped up, bubbly condition, thinking that a crash would come and that the reader would. It would be a classic dramatic irony. The reader would know something that the people in the book don't. And then when the crash did come, it turned out to be something much bigger and scarier and more systemic than I'd imagined. And of course, I was secretly very relieved because I thought I'd have wasted years of work writing a novel that's, thinking what goes up must come down. And at the same time, I was really interested in the detail of it. And I've kept up that interest because it seemed to me that there was something I hadn't really realised about just how important this language is. I mean, it's an embarrassing fact to admit, but I've got a very good degree from a very good university, and I worked on a political magazine, as Brad said, for 10 years. And I didn't know what fiscal and monetary meant until I was 50, which is really, really embarrassing. I'd never taken the trouble to just look it up and find it out. And I think there's a huge gap has arisen between people who understand money and economics and the rest of us. And a big part of this gap, it's almost embarrassing how simple it is. It's just to do with knowing what the words mean, what the money people are talking about. That's what lets them have control of the nilometer. If you take terms like you hear all the time, like interest rates, for example, it's a two-word term which we all kind of know what it means, but it packs in a great deal of knowledge about how things work, not just in markets and finance, but across whole societies. So when the financially literate talk about interest rates, they're bringing to bear a whole set of linked ideas. The interest rate is the cost of money at any given moment, which in itself for civilians is quite a hard idea to get your head around, the idea that money has a cost. And it's also the rate at which it's possible to invest completely free of risk, because you can buy a guaranteed government bond at that interest rate. So that means that when interest rates go up, 1, life is harder for businesses because money's more expensive. 2, people will tend not to invest in companies and equities, preferring to invest in risk-free bonds. So 3, the stock market will fall for that reason. So 4, confidence in business in general will fall. And 5, in parallel with that, people with mortgages will find it harder to make repayments, and those who are coming off fixed rate deals may suddenly have a dramatic increase in monthly repayments. So 6, that means mortgage defaults will rise. So 7, there'll be downward pressure on house prices. So 8, some people will be in negative equity and they'll stop spending and it'll have a depressing effect across the whole economy. But at the same time, 9, the currency will rise because higher guaranteed rates of investment bring money pouring into the country's debt. So 10, life becomes harder for manufacturing businesses because their exports are more importantly. And arguably most important of all, 11, inflation will fall. That's 11 ideas, all of them fairly complicated in their own right, packed into 2 words. And blink, and all those ideas linked, have just gone zooming past. And to people who don't really follow finance, who don't fully speak the language, the interlocking ideas are just too complicated to grasp at the necessary speed. You're just sort of lagging behind the argument. I think that C.P. Snow, who's a once famous novelist and public figure, he said that he talked about these 2 cultures of arts and science. And he said that the gap between them was too big and everyone should know, for instance, the second law of thermodynamics, which is the one that these singers Flanders and Swan, they had a great song about heat can't pass from the cooler to the hotter. You can try it if you like, but you really better not. That's the second law of thermodynamics. And similarly, everyone should know what interest rates are and why they matter, and what monetarism is and what GDP is, and hundreds of other terms too. And there are about 300 of them in the book. And then from the starting point of language, you begin to have the tools to make up an economic picture of the world, or pictures. And that was my ambition for the book, to give the reader those tools. And my hope was that after reading it, people would feel that, they had their own nilometer, they knew how to work it. And they could listen to the economic news or read the money pages or the Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times and know what's being talked about, and just as importantly, have a sense of whether they agree or not. Because I think that it's a bit like Dr. Spock, the famous book about childcare. Trust yourself, you know more than you think you do. I think the details of modern money are often complicated, sometimes deliberately complicated, but the principles underlying those details aren't. And my ambition for the book was to leave the reader feeling much more confident in their own sense of what those principles are. And I also wanted it to be entertaining and fun and politically empowering, and to, make it not seem a subject that presses on people, because I think people feel very pressed on by the subject of money. So the book's in 3 parts. There's an introductory essay about economics in general, which is my sense of what's interesting about it, and also some of the ways in which it's gone wrong as a field. And then there's an afterword, which is about my sense of where the world is collectively and globally at the moment, and the difference between what's happening between societies and between countries, which are 2 different things. And then, as Brad was saying, the middle part, the middle sort of 2/3, is a lexicon, a glossary of terms from the world of money. So this is the bit I'm going to read uniquely for this book. I'm just going to read out a few of the definitions. And the first one, and some of them are kind of core concepts in economics and finance, and some of them are things that just piqued my interest. And some of them are things that I think are really important that don't really play much role in formal economics per se. And the first of them is in that category. It's something I call the AAAAA number. It's the very first thing in the lexicon. The AAAAA number. A term I've just made up to denote 16,438 for the purpose of making sure it comes first in this lexicon. This number is, in the words of Melinda Gates, the most important statistic in the world. It's the number of children under 5 who aren't dying every day, compared with the number of children who were dying daily in 1990. The change is from 12.6 million to 6.6 million deaths a year, a total of 6 million children's lives saved every year. Why isn't this a famous fact, a famous success? As Melinda Gates says, the number of child deaths has gone down every single year for 50 years. I challenge you, she says, to name something else that gets better on that kind of schedule. Do you remember those really annoying ads when celebrities would click their fingers and say, solemnly, every time I click my fingers, a child dies? prompting someone in Ireland to shout at Bono, who was clicking his fingers on the screen, "Stop fecking doing it then!" That could now be shown the other way round, to make the point about how many children's lives are saved. The annoying celebs could click their fingers every 5 seconds to show a child's life, not a child not dying, a child's life being saved. That's still 6.6 million deaths too many, but surely Melinda Gates is right that the UNICEF statistic, published every year in mid-September, matters a lot more than most of the numbers plastered all over the media every day. The second one is about onions. This is a small fact, but it's one that really tickled me. Onions. Onions, particularly their price, provide an example of the kind of thing I'd never thought about for a second until I began taking an interest in the subject of money and reading the financial pages. Here is my favourite money-related onion-based fact. Onions are so important in India that the government has twice fallen, in 1980 and in 1998, because of surges in their price. And funnily enough, when I was in New York, someone actually knows the reason for the volatility of the onion prices. Came up at the talk, and the person responsible. Anyone know who's responsible for the volatility of onion prices? Gerald Ford, because when he was a congressman, there was a controversy about farm prices, and one of the scandals that occasionally comes up about people trying to manipulate prices in the futures. And I can't remember which the affected state was. I can't remember where Ford was a congressman for. But he got onions specifically by law exempted from the commodities market in the futures. So there's no futures market in onions, which is one reason the price is so volatile. And there's also, by the way, there's no futures market in chickens. I don't know if you remember in Trading Places, that great movie, they trade pork bellies and beef carcasses and orange juice and things like that. But there's no futures market in chickens. So when McDonald's, the mad scientists at McDonald's had the idea for the chicken McNugget, but they couldn't put it on sale because they couldn't stabilise the price of chickens in the future and keep the price fixed, because they didn't want the price going up and down. That's not the way McDonald's works. And so there was no way of doing it. And what happens is a hedge fund run by a man called Ray Diello, I think it's called Blackwater. What they did, came up, the idea instead was of getting farmers to sign, creating futures contracts in cornmeal and soy, so the farmers could guarantee the prices of their feed, so the farmers in turn would then agree to fix the price of chickens a couple of years ahead, thus paving the way for the chicken McNugget. So it is literally the case that hedge funds invented the chicken McNugget through financial engineering in 1983. Okay, the next one is every economist's favourite joke. Every economist's favourite joke. It concerns the prevalence in economics of certain assumptions about perfect information, efficient markets, rational consumers, and so on. The joke runs as follows. A physicist, a chemist, and an economist are stranded on a desert island with nothing to eat. A can of soup washes ashore. The physicist says, "Let's smash the can open with a rock." The chemist says, No. Let's build a fire and heat the can until it explodes." The economist says, No. First, let's assume a can opener. It may not be strictly relevant here, but while we're on the subject of a profession's favourite joke, I feel the need to pass on every soccer writer's favourite joke, as told to me at least a dozen times back when I used to spend my Saturday afternoons writing soccer match reports. The story dates back to the days when an Irish footballer called George Best was the hard-partying, most famous soccer player in the world. A waiter comes into a hotel suite in the morning to find Best asleep on the bed with his arms around 2 naked women. In more elaborate versions of the story, they are the current and previous year's Miss World. At the foot of the bed are a number of magnums of champagne emptied and upended in ice buckets. Best has been to a casino the night before, and the bed is also liberally strewn with £100 notes. The waiter shakes his head mournfully and says, George, where did it all go wrong?" Gold. Gold. The metal has been mined since the days of King Croesus in Lydia, circa 550 BC, hence rich as Croesus. It's been used as a currency and source of value ever after, despite or because of the fact that it holds no practical use or value in itself. The exception, amusingly, is in the most modern industry of all, technology. For the first time in history, we now actually have a practical use for gold. It's been estimated that about 12% of the world's gold is in use in electronics. Oddly enough, the other place where it's in practical use is in Vietnam, where all property purchases have to be made in gold. Gold does not tarnish, is portable but satisfyingly heavy, looks attractive, is fungible or easily interchangeable, and is very hard to mine. That's a virtue for a currency, because it means there's no easy way for someone to find loads of it and suddenly make the value decline. All the gold in the world would fit in a cube roughly 20 metres on each side. Those reasons add together to make gold historically the most popular underpinning for coinage and thence for paper money and modern currencies. Gold hasn't played this role globally since 1971, when President Nixon ended the Bretton Woods system in which the US dollar was underpinned by gold reserves and linked to foreign currencies through fixed exchange rates. The value of gold sharply declined after that, losing 2/3 of its value, but in the noughties, as global uncertainties rose, gold had an extraordinary 10 years, surging in price from $271 an ounce in 2001 to a peak of more than $1,800 in 2011. The explanation for that is that, quote, gold is where money goes when it's scared, unquote. That makes no sense at all, really, because gold has no actual innate value, but for about a decade it did seem to be true, though it has again lost a quarter of its value since around the end of 2013, and as of February this year was trading at 1,250. My personal favourite fact about gold is that because it takes extraordinarily strong forces to make it, all the gold in the universe comes from the inside of exploding supernovas, or, according to a new theory, from inside colliding neutron stars. Either way, awesome. Yakimov. Sorry. Right, that's the last time I ever give a reading. It's jinxed. I bet you've indirectly referred to this place in the Czech Republic at some point in the last week. If you're interested in money, you'll have certainly used it at some point in the last day, maybe even in the last hour. How so? Can you guess? Give up? Well, the Bohemian town of Jakimov is known in German as Joachimsthal. Does that help? Well, it was the site of a famous silver mine, a town that grew tenfold in population in 10 years, from 1516 to 1526, as it became the centre of a boom based on the manufacture of a once famous silver coin known as the Joachimsthaler. In time, it became abbreviated to just the thaler or taler. The coins were a standard size and form of currency throughout much of Europe for 400 years, and it's from the ubiquity of the thaler that we get the word dollar. So every time a dollar is mentioned, someone is unknowingly citing this otherwise obscure spot in rural Bohemia. One of the things I was trying to do, I call it sort of Mary Poppins process of spoonful of sugar making the medicine go down, and there are a number of themes run through the definitions, as you can probably tell, and one of them is to do with where money comes from. A thing that often preoccupies people they're very interested in is just sort of what money is, and it's actually a very difficult question to really get your head around when you have these digital dots on a screen, ones and zeros, that actually turn into something so incredibly real and pressing on our daily lives, really determining what we do, where we live, who we are. And so one of the threads in the book is to tracing the history of the money from the thing of gold and silver and the physical coins through to its actually very hard to comprehend modern virtuality. So I basically go all the way from Yakimov and King Croesus to Bitcoin. And it's still, even with that, it's money and moneyness are still very hard things to understand. Okay, we've got time for a couple more. Monetarism. When he was putting together the multi-volume supplement to the Oxford English Dictionary, the lexicographer in charge of the huge project, Robert Birchfield, had final responsibility for deciding which words went into the dictionary and which didn't. Since the whole point of that great masterpiece is that it's a historical dictionary of every word that's ever been used, the bar for inclusion is set pretty low. If you're a word, all you need is a couple of genuine citations and you're in. When he was signing off on the letter M for the second volume of additions to the dictionary, 2 words were right on the margin for inclusion for Birchfield. One was middlescence, a fairly horrible new word, following on from T.S. Eliot's inspired coinage of the word juvescence by an imaginative leap from the word senescence in his poem Gerontion. So we have the word senescence, Eliot makes up juvescence, and some idiot coins middlescence to put in the middle. The other new word, equivalently rare and marginal, was monetarism. Both words only just made the cut. This reflects the fact that in the late 60s and thereabouts, monetarism was an obscure, marginal, discredited idea from the distant fringes of economics. By 1979, it had become the guiding principle of both UK and US economic policy under the leaderships of Margaret Thatcher and subsequently Ronald Reagan, the most determined monetarists ever to have charge of developed economies. The principles of monetarism grew out of the study of economic history via the work of Milton Friedman. Monetarism's central focus was on the amount of money in the economy. The idea, simply put, is that the way to control an economy is to control the amount of money moving inside it. In the 1970s and early 1980s, Britain was suffering from high inflation, which monetarists see as a disease of money. Monetarist policy dictated a reduction in the amount of money in circulation and sought to achieve that end by making money more expensive, in other words, by raising interest rates. This policy worked in the medium term, though at the cost of hugely increased unemployment and consequently increased social division. By the late 1980s, monetarism had gone back out of fashion, where it remains to this day, largely because it's a theory that makes predictions about the way things should work, and these theories were contradicted by events, such as the decoupling of inflation from the money supply in the early noughties. In monetarism, these two phenomena are linked. In reality, they proved not to be, because the early years of the century saw the money supply go up, but inflation stayed down. The money supply turned out to be a model rather than a permanent truth. In this case, it went wrong by failing to allow for the impact of growth in China. Monetarism is generally seen as the ideological opposite of Keynesianism. Okay, a couple of quick ones. Saint Pierre and Miquelon. Saint Pierre and Miquelon are the answer to the question, where in North America do they use the euro? These two islands, just off Newfoundland, are overseas collectivities belonging to France. The population consists of about 7,000 French and French Canadians. Their economy is mainly based on fishing. As well as using the euro, it's also the only place in North America ever to have used the guillotine in 1889. If you write a novel about that, I personally guarantee it will win loads of literary prizes. Okay, one last one. Oh, sorry, yes, I'm going through in alphabetical order. That's right. Okay, last one, tournament. Tournament. The word has a particular, rather interesting meaning in economics. It's a structure in which a number of contestants compete for a prize, and the rewards are allocated not according to how productive people are, but according to who does better at the tournament. In the words of the original 1981 paper proposing a theory of tournaments, the tournament applies to, quote, compensation schemes which pay according to an individual's ordinal rank rather than his output level. That might sound incredibly boring, but tournament theory is responsible for the system in which pay at the CEO level of firms has got so insanely high. The idea is that because winning the tournament brings grotesquely disproportionate rewards, people are willing to work extremely hard to win the tournament. So although you have a CEO who's overpaid in relation to what he, usually a he, does, you have 100 other executives jockeying for position to be next in line to be the next CEO. So the incentive effects of high pay spread throughout the organisation. This might sound as if it's bullshit because nobody thinks like that, but I've spoken to at least one city person who does. He said when he hit 35 and was by most standards already very rich, he sat down to think about what he wanted from work. He realised that the only thing he didn't have that he would like to have would be a private jet. In order to have one, he calculated he would have to rise to be CEO of his or somebody else's company. He thought that if he worked 50% harder than he currently did for 10 years, he would have a 33% chance of being a CEO and getting his jet. He concluded that the odds weren't worth the extra effort and lack of personal life, and so he decided he was happy where he was. In this context, he decided not to take part in the tournament. Examples of tournaments include the process of becoming a partner at a law or accountancy firm, where many young people work thousands of hours to the huge benefit of the firm in order for only one or two of them to be made partner. The stagiaire system in restaurants, in which ambitious young chefs spend months at a time working for free, is another example, though it's also a way in which people acquire valuable experience they couldn't get any other way. In fact, high-end restaurant kitchens are dependent on this pool of unpaid skilled labour. Okay, very last one, and I'm going out of alphabetical order here. This is called Benford's Law. Benford's Law, a seriously cool but quite strange law of math. It says that in many types of random data, the number 1 is the most frequently occurring number, cropping up as much as 30% of the time. This turns out to be a surprisingly useful finding, in that it's often employed to detect phony figures in areas such as accounting and science, and in frauds such as the one of Bernie Madoff. The math is immensely complicated, and I would love to give a full explanation of it here, but unfortunately I have to rush off now because I've just remembered I've got a thing. Thank you very much. So, questions, don't forget about the microphones.
John, thank you very much. Both informative and entertaining. I have two quick responses. One is the presence of 2 French colonies in the mouth of the St. Lawrence River in Canada. I work for the RAND Corporation, where we focus on national security and defense. And whenever we review the disposition of our allies' forces, there are 12 and 6 French soldiers on those islands, respectively. So the French are still among us here in North America, guarding their turf.
Whereas we Brits very politely left.
Okay. And the second is, I think you gave good old King Croesus just a little less than his due. The brilliance of Croesus was that before him, it was barter. That meant you loaded up sheep and you sailed to Tyre and you swapped sheep for cloth. You sailed from there to Egypt and swapped. And if the market was bad for sheep in Tyre, you were stuck with this shipload of sheep, and it became very inefficient. But currency, gold coinage, made this much more efficient, and there came the wealth of Croesus and Lydia, and as rich as Croesus became the standard that we use. So I agree with you. He was very important. I just want to give him a bit more credit, if I may.
Okay,
Thank you.
I apologise to King Croesus.
Don't apologize too hard. He had it well.
Okay, thank you.
I'd like to ask a question about capital, which I'm sure most people have read here. I've been on streets I've lived in London the last 2 years. I've been on streets in Wandsworth and Clapham And I felt sure that this must be the street that John Lanchester wrote about in Capital. Did you have any particular street in mind?
I didn't quite know. I mean, I blended several things. It's a lot like the area I live in, except the houses are worth about twice as much as my actual house, unfortunately. And so I borrowed and conflated different bits. So it's not directly based on anything. But I've always had that thing of, one of the things in my head was, when you walk down those streets, I often wanted that feeling that, like with a doll's house, when you can lift off the front and look through into the house. And that was one of the sort of seeds for the book, was that feeling of walking down those very familiar terraced streets and just being able to take the front off the houses.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure. I guess part of the premise of this book is that if you understand the terminology, then you might understand the world around you a little bit better. But one of the things I enjoyed about Capital, which features a master of the universe, I guess, who did understand the terminology, is he had no idea really what was happening in the world around him. So do you think that actually the people who do speak the language of finance do really understand better, or do they just understand each other better?
I think that, you do get things where I think the languages of money is a very effective tool for people communicating with each other. It's almost too effective because it means people sort of turn towards each other. One of the starting points of the book, I was at an amazing thing they have in Ireland called Kilkenomics, which is the world's first ever festival of comedy and economics. And the first one was in 2010, and it's a very Irish thing about, you're either going to laugh or cry, so you might as well laugh. And every panel in it had a mixture of economists and comedians. And a thing that was really interesting was, as economists started talking and using their specialist vocabulary, you could actually physically see it. They started turning towards each other. And the audience was there, and they were sort of like turning away. And communicating very effectively and powerfully with each other, but with the effect of sort of excluding the audience. And having the comedians there was very useful because they just kept interrupting, usually saying, by the way, nobody in this room has a fecking clue what you're talking about. And they kind of and it was interesting and rather moving because you could see actually when the economists were reminded they did want to connect with the audience. So I think part of the thing about, the language is powerful and effective for people who speak it, but it is also sometimes complicated, and sometimes the kind of complexity of the acronyms feeds into, there's a tipping point, and it becomes obfuscatory and people actually don't follow it. So the thing in the credit crunch are characters like Roger. When you had things like, this is a real life example, super synthetic CDSs made of synthetic CDOs which are based on RMBS. Now all of those are real things, but it's also fantastically complicated, and it's not clear whether the complexity of the descriptions did actually cause a kind of disconnect. That at the high levels of these companies you had people who are, this is a thing that's freshly surprising. Even if you find out about it, some things become more surprising rather than less the more you know. And one of them is that they literally didn't know what they were doing at the senior levels of these big banks, at the director level of these huge, globally, systemically important organizations, literally not knowing what their own companies were doing. And I think that the underlying thing is the complexity of the actual product. But I think that there is a point at which the language got so complicated that it just made it easier to say And certainly Roger, the character in my book, is all about frightfully good, yeah.
Hi. When discussing financial concepts, I think it's always important, or society in general, it's important to look at incentives. And there was an interesting statistic that came out within the last few months. It talked about the average 401k increasing something in the neighborhood of 3.8% per, over the last 20 or 30 years, when a common index had increased double that amount. So it could be argued that the financial services industry profits from the confusion that they sow. I actually think that could be the case. I'm wondering whether or not, it's almost like a fool's errand, if you will, to attempt to understand it, because the incentives are in place for them to make it confusing so that your choices will be suboptimal.
I agree with that. On the other hand, though, that not knowing can't be better.
Agreed.
It can't be preferable. But yeah, no, I do. It's funny. Whenever you have a book out, there's always a question that you aren't really expecting, but that keeps coming up. And with my first book, Brad was kind enough to mention The Debt to Pleasure, which is a novel about a sort of sociopathic, food-obsessed, psychopathic snob gourmet who murders a whole bunch of people. And the question I was most often asked was, is it autobiographical? And I never figured out a way, to this day I still haven't figured out a way of answering that. Yeah. And the one that comes up with this is, how deliberate is it? You know, it's a question people are really interested by, the question of the deliberate level of the obfuscation or not. And I've been thinking about it quite a lot. And I think what I think is that actually it doesn't matter. If someone's talking about super synthetic CDSs, it doesn't matter if they're deliberately trying to confuse you. If the net effect is that you're bamboozled. And I think that in the industry there's a lot of that thing that's on the margin between, they're fine knowing what they're doing and they don't really care whether you know or not. And the principle of caveat emptor, buyer beware, is actually the only thing that's the central reality of how the system works. It's entirely up to you to protect your own interests, because actually no one else will, which for me is an argument for knowing the language.
No, agreed. But at the consumer level, like most of us don't deal at a super synthetic CDO level. I certainly don't, and I'd venture most of us here in the room don't. But even at the consumer choice level, I think we're purposely I think it is deliberate to confuse us, because capitalists maximize profits. If we make suboptimal choices, there's more margin in the business.
At the consumer level, I think there is definitely intention. Yeah, no question. I mean, in fact, the book I wrote about the credit crunch, some of the examples of that were really scandalous. Of things like people turning up from people who'd never had a house before, subprime borrowers, turning up at the assignment things where they were signing paperwork, and they would turn up. And there are some states where you don't need legal representation at these things. They turn up, and the broker would give them say, "Look, I'm really sorry. I know I said we could get a 6% loan. There was a problem at the bank at the last minute. We could only get 12%. I mean, I'm not making this is an actually specific example. We could only get 12%. But the thing to, you do want the house, don't you? So the thing to do is sign off on the paperwork, and then we can fix the thing about the loan. We can sort it out later," which is a direct, flat, knowing untruth. With no legal redress. And, try arguing the intent away from that.
Actually, this whole discussion segues perfectly into a story that I wanted to tell everyone that relates sort of to all of the extremely tricky language in credit card agreements that Congress finally came down on. And my story is that my brother-in-law in California he's a retired attorney now, but when he was working, he was the general counsel of a large corporation that was being put upon by the EPA with some very long-winded regulation. So their strategy turned out to be that they took a retired English teacher into court with them, who then proved through attempting to diagram the sentence of the regulation that the sentence, in fact, made no sense. And so my lawyer relative therefore won the case.
Yeah, very good. Hooray for him. That's quite. I mean, the other thing though is even when it, I think they rely on the fact that even when it does make sense, which isn't by no means all the time, they also do rely on the fact that people don't read it. There was an experiment. I don't think it was reported much here, but about a week or so in the UK, there was a big story that because someone had put in the small print. This was just for signing up for free Wi-Fi, and they put in the small print that people signed away ownership of their firstborn children in the Wi-Fi, and nobody read it. They were just cheerfully, legally signing away their firstborn, and they rely on that a lot.
Good evening. I'm a law student here in DC, and in studying law, I've been struck by a very similar experience of alienation between the general public, the layperson, and the law, and of course the absurdity behind that in a democracy. And I'm curious. I'm interested in following the same ambition as you and being able to educate the general public in that. And I'm curious if the method that that you used as a dictionary. What was the thought behind that? Did you have other possible mediums?
Well, I did think about it a lot. For me, I came to feel that the first obstacle, and actually the main obstacle, was just that very simple one of plainly and literally knowing what the words mean. That for me was a kind of initial big barrier, and that's why I went for this structure. I mean, one of the things that that I notice is that the terms in the book aren't the same as the key concepts in economics. If you're doing a thing of key economic concepts, you would use different words. But what my view about that was that actually quite a lot of stuff in economics we kind of get. Things like supply and demand, which is completely central to the field. It's a whole area of study and scholarship in its own right. But actually we get it, basically. Civilians can understand the way supply and demand are interlinked and so central. Whereas other things that seem very normal to insiders are actually more are kind of harder to get your head around. Things to do with the way that bonds pay out and yields and price being inversely correlated and things like that. That insiders know that off by heart, but it's actually quite hard to get your head around. And so I'm a writer, so maybe I would say the words are really important. But I do think that someone was saying, if you had to choose between math or English, which would it be for this stuff? And I've been thinking about that, and actually for me it would be English, because if you can't grasp the concepts, you can't then, as it were, deploy the math. So in the field of law, I imagine there's an extensive body scholarship, reasoning, and things to know. But I still think that the as I say, the first hurdle is that thing of just what the words refer to. But good luck with it.
Let me, this is not really a defense of any industry, but simply to ask the question, is the question of language anything other than various human beings trying to express very complicated issues quickly and efficiently to their colleagues that they're trying to contact? This builds up in every discipline, doesn't it? For instance, take the tax. This morning, there was an article in the Financial Times or one of the papers that said, double Irish sandwich under attack. Now, what does that mean? It refers to a complicated tax structure to avoid U.S. taxes. But the issue is the professionals developed this language just as a shortcut to communicate. And do we go a bit too far in criticizing them because we don't understand it?
I think it's a fair point. But the thing is, all fields do have specialist vocabulary, but the thing that's distinctive about that of economics is how often things don't mean what they seem to mean. I think it's partly because of I think it's to do with the pressure of innovation. Think of a hedge fund having turned from a kind of hedge into this abstruse mathematical technique. That's a historical process, and it nonetheless ends up with a thing that you can't understand what a hedge fund is without someone explaining it to you in some detail. And I think that if you take example that everything has technical terms. I often think of things like plumbing, which has J curves and U bends, but actually you can figure out what a J curve is and what a U bend is roughly. You don't know what it does or how to use it or how to deploy it, but the language is a rough guide. Whereas something like quantitative easing, that sounds like a brand of laxative. What do you think of quantitative easing? I don't know, but my grandmother used to recommend prunes, And actually, in fact, quantitative easing is one. I think there's a kind of sinister blandness to it. The language doesn't tell you what it is. It doesn't tell you that it's a kind of amazing new way of governments to print money without actually admitting that they're printing money. And, securitization, you think somehow etymologically it's to do with things being safe, but actually it's to do with this, again, abstruse technique for chopping things up and selling them off. And I think that the biggie, the most consequential one is, I'm not that old, but I can remember when there was this bad thing that you did everything you could to avoid. You were brought up to avoid it and fear it, which was called debt. And now we have this groovy, exciting, sexy, positive thing called credit. And which is exactly the same. I think if everyone told themselves that it's not a credit card, it's a debt card, our kind of mental frames would be very different. So I don't think, again, I don't think it's intent that causes these things to be more confusing. But I think that the key point is that, the example I use in the book is quantum chromodynamics. Now, you cannot do quantum chromodynamics in the comfort and safety of your own kitchen. But you can kind of know, well, quantum, that's kind of weird modern physics stuff. Chromo is somehow to do with colour. I mean, it's metaphorical colour, but it's still that. And dynamics is it's a process. And actually, you kind of roughly know what quantum chromodynamics is. But you can't know what quantitative easing is without someone telling you.
So we're just about out of time, but let me ask you one last question. So was there any term that you couldn't figure out that left you stumped?
Oh, they come up all the time. I mean, I went on a phone-in in Australia, and the host and the thing very helpfully said, ask John anything you like about anything from the entire world of economics and finance and indeed life. So I said, oh, this is going to be good. And the very first one was, what do you think about negative gearing? To which I had to say, I've no idea, because the first time I heard of it was when you said it 3 seconds ago. So all this stuff keeps going. But it's amusingly or grimly, it's often to do with a scandal. Something blows up and it suddenly turns up there's this huge thing that you've never heard of until 5 minutes ago, whether it's Libor or Forex scandals or the London whale or whatever. So it's in terms of things being surprising and sometimes outraging, sometimes really interesting. This subject really is the gift that keeps giving. Thank you very much. Thank you.